Hi friends, Andrew Carruthers from The Journeyist, and welcome to episode number 5 of The Journey of Sunday. Today we want to kind of flip the script from last week, because last week we talked about what gets in our way with spirituality, and today what we want to start to talk about is what do we do to actually open that connection that we have with that sense of spirit. And of course, with all things spiritual, as we've been discussing, this is going to be incredibly unique to each person watching, so that's part of the discussion, right? So I'll get us started with just some of the things that I know have helped me over the years to really open up that connection to my sense of spirituality. For me, it's all about getting this thing quiet first, because if this is super chattery, it's really difficult to find that connection. There's a couple ways that I go about it, and I think it's pretty similar to a lot of other people. And I kind of feel like there's two different kinds of practice that we go through. One's more of a silent practice or a still practice. So this might be something like prayer, seated meditation. The thing I think is so interesting is this is probably the most common way to practice, but I also feel like it's the most difficult. I think when we're just trying to sit still, this thing is really hard to get to quiet down. And I know that for a lot of people that I've talked to, especially that have tried different kind of meditation techniques, that's kind of the first thing that they get frustrated with, is they go and they just sit and they think that they're going to be able to quiet this thing by just sitting still and breathing. That's a pretty advanced technique, honestly. What I've found is easier for me is active practices. So these are things like yoga, aikido, just walking meditations, where you're actually engaging the body into some type of activity. What I've found for me is that it really helps me to get this thing to shut down a bit and to just focus on that connection that I'm trying to create. And I think what happens when we engage the body into these practices is it actually kind of wakes up the intelligence of the body, because we're so up here all the time that we forget that there's actually intelligence from here down. And so we kind of cut off from that. I also find that study is a great way for me to connect deeper, because as I discover more about different religions and different belief systems, new truths and new discoveries come up for me all the time. Then you also start to discover that things aren't so different from place to place, that really we're all saying a lot of the same things. We might call it different things or use different words, but there's a lot of similarities in how people explore and believe in that spirit world. And a lot of these things that I've mentioned so far are things that I do tend to do fairly solo most of the time, but there's definitely a different experience when we do it with a community. So especially Aikido, when I practice Aikido, of course, 90% of the time it's at the dojo with other people. Also, even just going to a yoga class versus doing yoga here in my living room definitely has a different experience to it. I know for some of you, community is a huge piece to your spiritual access. To me, it's not as essential, but I do feel like I get something different from it. The piece that has truly become most apparent to me in the last about 2 years is the consistency. Because I go in and out, and I'm sure a lot of you can relate to this, I go in and out of times of being super consistent with my practices, and then also getting very lazy or overwhelmed with other stuff. You know, in the last video, we talked about one of the big blocks being the fact that we just live in this lifestyle of this hyper productivity. And it's easy to get wrapped into that and just work all day, work all night, and not leave ourselves that space for spiritual practice. I picture that connection to spirituality as a bit of a pathway or even kind of a tunnel for me. And if I'm practicing consistently, that pathway stays very open. The more inconsistent I get, and the more time that goes between those practices, it's like there just leaves more space for stuff to pile up in there and block up that path. And just to kind of wrap this up, I will share with you one goal that I've had recently, which is to find a way to incorporate that connection into more things that I do, because I don't feel like it has to only happen when we sit down for meditation or sit down for prayer. I think we can find that space for spirit almost every single thing we do throughout the day. So those are my personal views on how I have found best to open that connectivity. I'm super open to more ideas and I'd like to try more things, so I'm looking forward to your comments and seeing what you do to open that pathway for you to your spirit. So I definitely invite you to continue that interactivity. I hope that you'll continue to contribute really openly. And, bravo to a lot of you out there that are being very brave and very open with those comments. It's not easy to do, especially around a spiritual conversation. Thank you so much for spending some time with me today. Thank you so much for taking time for your comments. I'll see you next Sunday on the Journey of Sunday.